This video is being sponsored by Minwax, offering a wide variety of wood stains, finishes, conditioners, fillers, and more for your woodworking projects. Learn more about their products at minwax.com. Minwax makes and keeps wood beautiful. Occasionally, potential clients will ask me to build a furniture piece with turned legs. I usually turn down these types of commissions because I'm not very good at wood turning, especially when it comes to making copies. In this instance, I gave the option to build a trestle dining table with baluster legs, so long as my client was fine with choosing a set of turned legs from a reputable manufacturer. My client chose to go with the Grand Tavern dining table leg made of red oak from Osborne Wood Products. I then drafted a design that included the Grand Tavern legs as the balusters for the leg assemblies, a shaped foot and top brace, a scalloped long and short apron, and a lower stretcher to join the leg assemblies. Once my client agreed on the design, I started breaking down all the parts from 8/4 red oak. The feet ended up being 3.5 inches thick, which required that I laminate 2 pieces of 8/4 material. On the other hand, the aprons, top brace, stretcher, and of course the panel glue up for the tabletop are all comprised of milled 8/4 material. I then went to the bandsaw and ripped the 8 to 10 inch wide boards down to rough thickness. I typically will oversize my rips by 1/4 inch in width so that I have plenty of material to work with during the milling process. In order to get the feet glued up and laminated, I flattened one face of each of the laminations. Once flattened, I spread a generous amount of glue, clamped up the laminations, and set the feet aside while I milled up the rest of the table parts. Once I flattened all the pieces, I then edge jointed to get 2 square surfaces. I did the same for the laminated feet once the glue had cured. I then dimensioned all the parts to final thickness on the planer in preparation for joinery. The legs arrived from Osborne Wood Products at a length of 29 inches with a decorative end. There's pretty much nothing that you have to do in order to use these legs from Osborne Wood Products. They're perfectly sanded and pretty much ready to go. I simply cut the legs down to size on the miter saw. While I was at the miter saw, I cut the rest of the base assembly parts down to final length as well. To join the legs, aprons, top brace, and feet, I kept it simple and decided to use floating tenons, or dominoes. I simply scribed a center line on all of the mating pieces and marked an X at the mortise locations so as not to be confused during the joinery process. To hold down my material, I like using toggle clamps on a workbench with dog holes. It's a quick and easy way to secure my material in various orientations. Once the mortises were cut on the top brace and foot, I marked the mortise locations on the baluster legs. I then secured the legs to my workbench and plunged my domino to cut the mating mortises. Next, I marked the locations for the mortises on the side of the legs and the adjoining aprons. The long aprons have a notch that needed to be removed to fit against the top brace. That task was simply done at the crosscut sled on my table saw with a flat bottom blade. I then head back to the workbench, secure the work with toggle clamps, and plunge the domino to make the mortises in the aprons and on the inside faces of the baluster legs. With the joinery complete, I did some pre-assembly by gluing the slip tenons to the ends of the aprons and the ends of the baluster legs. The domino tenons will help keep the work elevated while applying finish by resting the tenons on a pair of cauls. I also started using a glue tip designed by Steve at Extreme Woodworker to squeeze glue into the domino mortises. I had someone local 3D print Steve's design. Make sure to check out his channel to find out more about these glue tips. I made 3 templates from 1/4 inch MDF to trace out the serpentine curves along the top brace and the foot, and the scallops on the bottom of the aprons. Prior to cutting out the curves on the bandsaw, I made some relief cuts on the aprons so that I could easily make the straight cuts using the fence on the bandsaw. And while you can't see it in the video, I did use some supports on the outfeed side to properly support my work. It's then just a matter of cutting out the curves on the bandsaw, making sure to leave the pencil line. I once read an article by Michael Fortune in Fine Woodworking magazine where he talks about cutting smooth curves on the bandsaw. Michael suggests pivoting off of the back of the blade by rotating the stock slightly so that the rear of the blade is touching the kerf left behind by the bandsaw blade itself. If you pivot off of the front of the blade, the teeth end up gouging into your wood and leaving these undulations in your cut. I've used this technique many times, and it seems to always give me great control and a relatively smooth cut around curves. For final shaping and to remove the few bandsaw marks that are left behind, I used a combination of a disc sander and spindle sander. To attach the base assembly to the tabletop, I used shop-made wooden buttons. The wooden buttons hook onto oversized elongated holes on the top brace made by the domino mortiser. The final bit of shaping is done at the router table. The aprons and top braces get a 1/4 inch round over, while the feet get a 3/8 inch round over. I then start working on the tabletop. I previously chose the layout of the boards to get what I thought was most pleasing based on grain orientation and color. I then ripped the boards on the bandsaw to remove any curvature along the edges prior to flattening and edge joining at the jointer. Once I flatten, edge joint one edge, and plane down to thickness, I do a final rip at the table saw. To get a glue-ready edge, I've started using the inside-outside method on my joiner. Simply put, each joining edge receives an alternating I or O to signify I in towards the fence of the joiner or O out away from the fence of the joiner. This is done to create 2 complementary edges and to cancel out any variation in your joiner fence if it is not perfectly perpendicular. It may seem redundant to edge joint, run the second edge through the table saw, and then edge joint again, but I trust my joiner to get a glue-ready edge over my table saw blade. To help with alignment on large panel glue-ups, I like to use my biscuit joiner. I've done smaller panel glue-ups without biscuits, but on larger panel glue-ups, it's difficult to get everything lined up, especially as the boards tend to slip when you start applying clamping pressure. I could use my domino mortiser, but I feel as though my biscuit joiner is the better tool for the job by offering some lateral movement while perfectly aligning the boards vertically. To glue up the panels, I'm using PVA glue. I first glue in the biscuits on one edge. I then lay that edge down on a pair of sawhorses and apply glue into the biscuit slots of the adjoining edge. I then spread glue along that edge with a glue roller. I make sure to get good even coverage, which leaves a manageable amount of glue squeeze out. Once the glue cures and the panel is taken out of the clamps, I use either a card scraper, cabinet scraper, or chisel plane to remove the hardened glue squeeze out. To cut the panels to final dimension, I'm using my track saw in conjunction with a pair of parallel guides and guide rail square. The parallel guides and guide rail square are a third-party aftermarket tool that attach to my guide rail, and they ensure that the edges of my large panel are perfectly parallel and perpendicular to each other. The wooden buttons that attach the tabletop to the base assembly are made out of 3/4 inch stock. I make the hook portion of the wooden button on the crosscut sled of the table saw, and then counterbore an oversized hole to accept a flat-headed screw. I then round the outside edge of the wooden button at the disc sander. With the base assembly dry fit and placed on the bottom side of the tabletop, I use a center punch to align the wooden buttons within the elongated holes of the top brace. I then drill a stopped hole and install a threaded insert with 2-part epoxy. The bottom edge of the tabletop received a 3/8 inch roundover, while the top edge received a 1/4 inch roundover. I find this type of thumbnail edge is more pleasing than simply using the same roundover on both the top and bottom edge. To do the initial sanding on this large of a panel, I like to use a belt sander. I go with the grain of the wood, and I'm using continuous movement to not remove too much material at any one given spot. The profiled edges are hand sanded with some cloth back sandpaper. Final sanding is done with a random orbit sander at 180 grit. For the smaller pieces that have a profiled edge, I like to use a soft interface pad on my random orbit sander. I vacuum all of my surfaces. It's time for stain and finish. I'm using Minwax's line of water-based stain and water-based polyurethane, and Minwax happens to be the sponsor of this video. Once all of my surfaces are free from debris, I apply Minwax's pre-stain conditioner to prevent streaks and blotching of the stain. I apply the conditioner with a terry cloth stain pad and then wipe away the excess with shop towels. Pre-stain conditioner will raise the grain of the wood, so I like to knock down the raised grain with a light sanding of 220 grit sandpaper. For the smaller flat and round pieces, I again use a terry cloth stain pad to wipe on the semi-transparent water-based stain. Once applied to the piece, it's important to wipe away any excess and then applying additional coats to intensify the color. It's better to apply multiple light coats of stain than fewer heavy coats of stain. Larger surfaces tend to be a little tricky when applying a water-based stain. I found that a 4-inch foam roller is perfect for applying stain to larger surfaces. You can move quickly with better control on the amount of material that's being applied. Again, thinner coats work better than heavy coats. I ended up applying a total of 3 coats of stain to get the intensity of color that I wanted. Finally, I applied an oil-modified polyurethane, which is a water-based clear top coat with the warm look of a traditional polyurethane. To apply the polyurethane on the smaller pieces, I used a foam brush, making sure not to use excessive brush strokes. It's an apply and move on kind of application. Do not overwork the finish. If you do, you'll get streaks. Don't ask me why I know that. For larger surfaces, I'm using a 4-inch foam roller, and again, I'm making sure to not over-apply the finish by using excessive roller strokes. Once the finish is spread evenly, move on to the next section. Now, my absolute favorite way to apply water-based finishes is to use an HVLP spray gun. To atomize the finish, I'm using a 1.3mm tip with my turbine set to 5.5 psi. I'm able to get a streak-free and perfectly level finish that dries very fast. In fact, I was able to apply 3 coats within 2 hours. With the top coat dried, I can do final assembly. I first glue together the short apron to the baluster legs, and then glue the legs to the foot and the top brace. Finally, I join the 2 assemblies with the long aprons and lower stretcher. And there you have it, another commissioned piece delivered to a happy client. Thanks for watching.